Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Chats with Kat on the Voice of Adoptees podcast. I'm your host, Kat. I hope you're having a great week so far. Don't forget to grab a coffee, a tea, or a preferred beverage and settle on in. I'm currently here with Lynn, and she is an adoptee therapist. So before we begin and dive into any sort of conversations, just briefly introduce yourself to those who are listening.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Kat. My name is Lynn McKitten. People ask me a lot how I say my last name. And so, yep, it's McKitten. I am a mental health therapist. I am a addictions counselor. That's kind of my clinical background. But really in my everyday life, I am a small business owner. I own my own mental health practice here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And my focus is really supporting and helping folks who are marginalized and working with adoptees on identity, on all different sorts of things, but really just uplifting adoptee voices and being a support and a resource to adoptees here in Minnesota.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about your adoption story and interest and how you really just chose that path going into adoption, mental health for adoptees and for marginalized areas of groups of people. Sorry, can't talk. Too many thoughts going on at the same time because I have a lot of questions, a lot of things I kind of want to dive into. But what is your experience?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny that you asked that, Kat, because really I didn't go into this field being I'm going to become a therapist and I'm going to work with other adoptees and help adoptees improve and support their mental health.
Right.
I didn't even really know that was a possibility. I feel really happy and excited and privileged to be here and be able to work with the people that I get to. Really, like a lot of adoptees, I think I grew up in a town where there weren't a lot of people who looked like me, and I didn't know much about adoption or how it played a role in my life or my mental health. It was all about just assimilation. Kids just want to fit in.
Right.
So it's just just fit in, just do the things, go to school, get good grades. And so I didn't really even think this would have been a possibility. So little me is very happy right now that I get to share all these spaces with other adoptees. Right. But yeah, I came here to Minnesota. I was adopted when I was 4 months old. And I am fortunate to say that I was adopted alongside my identical twin sister, who is not also a therapist, but so different kind of unique part of my adoption story there is I do have my sister here and we're very close and she lives in Minnesota as well. So, and, just kind of normal childhood stuff living in the Midwest. If you'd if anyone who, is listening or watching has ever been to the Midwest, it's exactly what you think it is, very stereotypical, but just, did the things that any kind of normal kid does. And my parents, my adoptive parents have been supportive and great people, great people in my life. And also I didn't get to talk about adoption and I didn't get to really know that part of me until a lot later. And I probably say even late 20s, early 30s is when I started kind of learning about that part of myself. Right. So that really translated. I was just fortunate enough to kind of be working as a therapist and learning this new stuff about myself and about our community. And I was yeah, this is what I want to do. And so it kind of just happened magically. I put myself out there and I was yeah, I'm an adoptee. I love working with other adoptees. And right. It just, that's how it all came to be.
I love that. And so something I think is very interesting that you said your primary area of study and concentration and focus was addiction counseling, correct? Yeah.
Yes. Yep. That was, a big piece of
it.
it.
So this is very interesting to me because I every so often in my spare time, I try to read a bunch of different studies. And I mean, I kind of want to get into it. So let's get into it. From starting out with addiction counseling, what have you kind of noticed about addiction and adoption and the correlations between that? I just want to get into it. I love these kind of topics. So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think addiction goes hand in hand with mental health. Right. Those are things that just cannot be mutually exclusive. And so just wanting to know more about what makes people tick and how we express our emotions too. addiction is an expression of
Mhm.
emotion. It's sometimes a coping skill. But I mean, to be like pretty blunt, like there's a huge underrepresentation, I think, of adoptees in like a lot of spaces, just like other marginalized groups of
Mhm.
people. It's like you go to a doctor and they're like, this is the kind of medication that will help you. Like when you look at the sample of like the people that they're designing like medications and treatments for, it's not
Right.
adoptees, it's not marginalized people, it's not people of color, you know. And so there was, I don't think in many of the spaces that I worked in, like in a more formal clinical setting, that I got the opportunity to really work with a lot of adoptees. But just knowing the impacts too of like adoption trauma, there's no way that there's not a correlation between like those of us who experience or have experienced addiction, people in recovery, and then also like where we come from. And adoption is, you know, a big part of that.
So let's get into what you just mentioned about adoption trauma. What, for those who don't know, what is it? And could you explain a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think trauma, it's a big term, and it's a big term that we hear a lot about, but it's complex and it means a lot of different
Mhm.
things, and it means a lot of different things depending on the person that you're talking to. But this concept of like the adoption itself too can be a traumatic event in a lot of people's
Mhm.
lives. It's this idea of like what infants and like children need in their developmental like periods, in these like very like formative years, and that the trauma that can result as like, you know, not having those things.
Right.
And so just the act of a lot of us not being able to like form a close bond like with our mothers when we're first born, that can be traumatizing, and that can have results that last on into adulthood. So that's really what adoption trauma is really about, is kind of those initial like bonds, or those things that like we don't have the opportunity, or that we're denied when we're
Right.
babies.
And it kind of goes along with attachment theory. And something I thought was very interesting is I remember like listening to a lecture about this, and usually it's kind of like this theory, or not necessarily theory, but just the notion of you were a baby, you don't remember, and that in itself is very activating for many adoptees. And something I heard was that memory is a funny thing, because even though we are born with memory, but we just don't have the recall when we're a child, but we remember it, the body remembers. And I felt that was a very, very, very powerful thing. And do you think the attachment theory is based off of that for like, adoptees, for just groups of people who have gone through this sort of trauma in general?
Yeah. Attachment theory is so important. The one thing I say, or I like to kind of like have a little side note to be though too,
Mhm.
is like a lot of times there's this negative or like stereotypical idea that like all adoptees like have insecure or like avoidant or anxious attachment styles, and that's not the
Right.
case. And so while attachment theory, like I'm like absolutely, like there's tons of like scientific research to support like the attachment and the bonds that we form when we're infants and we're babies to say everything about like our attachment styles growing up. But it's not like a sentence of like, if you're adopted then you're going to have these,
Right.
you know, difficult, you know, ways of being, and you're not going to be able to form a secure attachment. That's not the case at all. But yeah, thinking about just like the things that we're denied, and like you said, like the memories that get stored elsewhere. It's like the memories that we can have like as like pictures or visuals in our mind, and then the ones that we can like vocalize and like talk about and describe, that's only a small percentage of the memories that we actually store in our body.
Mm.
And so it's just like when, especially when you're an infant and you're like new to this world and you're just taking in all these different like things, that's why that attachment period is so essential and so important, is because we don't have the abilities or skills yet to like have language and express how we feel. We're taking everything in through all these other senses. And so to say like later on to, it's just like, well, you don't remember anything, you were a blank slate, you were a baby, you don't have those memories. It's like, no, we do have those memories, but sometimes they come in the form of like, we feel it, we sense it in our body.
Right. So just even like based off of that, I guess what is a good way to try to be like articulated? Like I'm not sure how to explain it. A lot of the time I'm at a loss for lack of a better term to try to describe like what I'm feeling. Do you in your practice, are there other adoptees who also have this where they can't necessarily put what they're thinking into words? They know that they feel it, but they don't know how to communicate it properly. And do you think that can be the result of, the trauma that they have gone through and the loss and I don't know. I just think everything is kind of really connected. And I guess I like to analyze and try to figure out how, right? So don't
Yeah.
mind me, sorry.
Well, and I think no, no, I appreciate that because I think that is really something important to talk about. Something that I share or like I get a lot of questions about too is like, well, if I'm an adoptee or I'm just maybe even just a person who is looking for a therapist, like how do I find the right person for
Right,
me? And so like for a lot of adoptees who find me and like know then more about like I work with folks who are adopted
right.
also, it's like some of the like words or terminology I might use too is just like folks who experience complex trauma, folks who want to do identity work. And the this idea of like it's hard to describe what I'm looking for, but I kind of like know it when I see it or when I feel it. Like that's exactly some of the things that I work on with folks too, is like being able to like find different ways of expression, finding different spaces too where you can, talk and like practice or just try out new ways of expressing things, because there's a lot of things that like uh us as fellow adoptees, like we just kind of like know or like sense about each other and within ourselves, and it's like this unspoken
Right.
connection. But then to go and try to describe that to a therapist who maybe doesn't have a lot of like knowledge or understanding about like the adoptee experience, adoption trauma, etc. too, it can feel really invalidating.
Yeah.
It can be potentially harmful
Yeah.
even. So yeah, some of the work, a lot of the work I think is just like learning new ways to like communicate and express all these things that like we feel and like our
Yeah,
experience.
it's actually really funny that you mentioned about it just not necessarily it's it's funny how you mentioned about it because just then you mentioned where if you go to a therapist who potentially doesn't have that sort of understanding and experience of going through that adoptee journey, it could be very not validating in a way. And I think that's very interesting because I feel that that was my experience. Sometimes I talk to people about counseling and I always say like I had a really terrible experience and everything that I learned about how to express myself or how to try and word things or how I think or how I get through situations, I didn't learn from a therapist. I learned from myself. Maybe that's like a form. We're about to have a therapy session, I guess, but I guess it could be like a form of self defense, right? Like you want to be able to do it on your own because nobody else was able to help you, and no, or maybe nobody cared enough to help you, or they didn't have the right tools and they didn't know what to do. And naturally, like the best thing to do is to find a therapist that works for you. But what do you say to the adoptees who maybe they're having a hard time, and are there key points that they should look for in a therapist? That was a long way to get to my point. Sorry.
No, those are no such good questions too, and it's funny. Well, it's not funny. It's actually kind of like sad too because we don't learn those things. Like no one
Right.
does. We don't learn like about like what therapy is really. Sometimes there's a lot of like kind of stigma around therapy. There's a lot of stigma around mental health. There's a lot of
Right.
stigma around like substance use and addiction and things like that too.
Mhm.
So to even like know where to start, it's like we have maybe a lot of these questions and we don't have a lot of people like giving us the answers that we need or the support that we need.
Right.
But I would say like, yeah, come prepared to ask questions, like advocate for yourself and what you need.
Mhm.
I even tell like folks who have like consultations with me, I always say like have a consult with me, like meet me first, see if you actually really want to like work with me before you like invest, like this is your time and like your energy.
Right.
But yeah, see if you can have a consult with someone, ask them all the questions too. It's like this is for you and you're paying, good money for like this service too. So ask all the questions. What are your opinions or views on adoption?
Right.
Like what is the lens of like your adoption work? So are you an adoptee yourself? Like do you like work for an adoption agency? Like what's your stance on adoption? And it can feel kind of uncomfortable, but like ask those questions because then you're going to get set up for like the best possible success, because then you can know too. And it's okay, people can have different opinions
Mm.
about adoption and things like that, but I mean I've heard kind of some horror stories too from folks saying
Right.
really just awful things. And like, I just want to support and like help people maybe avoid being in those really harmful situations too, with a therapist who maybe is not like well equipped or knowledgeable about like adoptee
Right,
experiences.
because I mean, this there's a stigma around mental health and therapy, and but there's also a stigma around adoption, and adoptees, and maybe even like adoptees from particular from different countries. Every country kind of has like a stereotype. So there's this whole set of just a blanketed statement that is usually used, or one specific phrase that is associated, or something like that. We associate certain things with certain places, right? Maybe adoptees might be a little afraid of going to therapy to begin with, because it's kind of like a double whammy where you're adding two stereotypes make a or two problems make a bigger problem, sort of thing. Or maybe they're like ashamed or embarrassed. I've There's a lot of narrative a lot of the time over the fear of starting therapy, or the fear of being determined as weak, or things like that. And I that's like a general thing, but I also think it's very difficult when you're in a top D to try to. It's already difficult enough, you know. So yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. Because if we're already talking about like, mental health is often seen as this thing. It's just like, well, you either can't figure it out yourself, or there must be something really wrong with you if you're going to therapy. And it's like, no. When people ask me to, it's just like, who do you work with? I was like, I work with like excellent, like high achieving, like just really magnificent humans.
right,
And they're like, well, why would they need therapy? And it's like, because mental health is just a part of our lives and a part of us. It has nothing to do, going to therapy has nothing to do with like being
right,
broken or not being able to fix it ourselves. It's like people who desire better for themselves and who desire to like have growth and like transformation in their
right,
life. That's the people I get to work with. So yeah, but then there's this idea too, is just like either you're broken or there's something wrong with you, and that's why you're going to therapy. And for adoptees, I think one of the harmful stereotypes is like we are forever to be grateful.
yes,
It's like you're lucky. You're lucky to be adopted. So why would you have any issues? You should just be happy,
right,
like, your mom loved you enough to give you away, and now you have this other family who like,
mhm,
all this kind of weirdo rhetoric. It's not weird, but all this rhetoric, around like us being grateful.
right,
And so I think that's another thing that gets in the way for a lot of adoptees too, is just like, well, I feel shame if I like don't feel like good, or if I'm not feeling grateful or happy about like being an adoptee.
right.
It's all of those things. It's messy, it's hard, but that's just part of the human experience. And so why anyone would expect an adoptee then to have this like extra special level of just like, oh, everything's great all the time. Like, this thing happened to me when I was young and I should just be grateful, forever grateful. I'm not allowed to have any other emotions, like that seems, like a kind of unfair expectation.
Right. And I mean, something you just touched on is like the societal narrative for adoptees, that we all need to be happy and thankful and grateful. And there's a lot of adoptees who, I guess, in the eyes of society, that aren't, quote unquote, aren't. Very, very heavy quotes around the word, because I feel like it's a very activating phrase, and just word in general when paired with that. So it's a very hard thing, because I've been speaking with adoptees, and I had a different mentality up until recently, where I really met a lot of adoptees who helped open my mind and broaden my view. There's a lot of adoptees who only kind of want to hear one side of the story, and there's all these sort of coping mechanisms that we do as adoptees, and it's either we like deny, or we shove it down and we just go on with our life. We kind of displace it from our mind because we don't want to think about it, or we wallow, quote unquote, as used by other people in society. You can tell it's like a topic. It's a personal topic to me, just by the way I'm talking about it. But we dwell, or we wallow, or all those sort of negative terms, right? So it's like it's negative on one side. It's negative for the adoptee, quote unquote, negative. And then it's also like positive for the parent. And there's sort of this dynamic between adoptees and adoptive parents that conflicts. And that is something that I have really been just awakened to. And also like the sense of loss and grieving, and having to mourn your original family and not knowing them. I mean, what have you experienced in your practice without going into very specific names and cases and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't really add that in kind of this like idea or like the, types of issues or matters that I work on with folks too. It's
Right.
like grief and loss is a big part of that
Right.
too. I've intentionally sought out like, just additional trainings and certifications that I can do around grief and
Mm.
loss because there's so much of that with the adoptee experience.
Right.
And in addition to that, too, it's not something that is a recognized like loss or like an acceptable type of grief.
Right.
In our culture, it's like the grief and loss that comes with like the death of a loved one. Like there's rituals around that and there's expectations and people just kind of like know how to do and respond to that. But when adoptees and adoptee experiences are already kind of like
Mhm.
misconceptualized, like because of societal norms, like, oh, you're lucky, you're grateful, everything's great,
Right.
like no problems here,
Right.
then to try and speak up or get support around like I feel like deep loss. I feel deep loss about the people who are part of like my like ancestry and like my bloodline that I will never
Yeah.
possibly get the opportunity to like meet. I'm like grieving and like have like this ambiguous loss over like the person that I never got the opportunity to be had I my life been different or if I wasn't adopted. There's so many of these like very like nuanced and like ambiguous things too that aren't easily like there's not like a ritual or there's not like a plan or a thing that you do with that stuff. So adoptees are kind of sitting over here being like, yeah, I feel this. I feel this. I don't know necessarily what it is.
Mhm.
And at the same time, too, a lot of times when folks try to speak up about that, then we get kind of this
And the
negative feedback of like, well, now you're not
right.
being grateful. You can't be sad because that just means you're not being grateful
Right.
enough.
And
But it can be all those things at the same time.
right. And it just it goes back to like the narrative that society kind of pushes, like I mean, it's I also was like thinking of loss in terms of like loss of identity, loss of self-identity, loss of identity for the outside world, loss of trust, right? I mean, there's so many different areas to look at it. Like you can't trust other people because they're telling you to be a certain way, so you can't trust yourself to understand yourself enough to be able to move forward with different things that you're feeling inside of adoption and inside of your experience and your thoughts surrounding the loss of a whole other life that you could have had, and this is where imagination comes in, and sometimes we say, oh, maybe it could have been better if we're not necessarily having a great time, and we mourn that loss because we're mourning the loss of a life that we just didn't even know we could have had. And it's a very powerful sort of
Right.
sentiment when you think about it. I feel like I'm just regurgitating what you're saying, but I sit with it a lot. I sit with these sort of feelings a lot, and it speaks very the work you do speaks very deeply to me because this is I wish that I was able to have a great adoption therapist growing up because I was very lost and very confused and I was not heard at all. And I wonder if that's also like another common sort of theme with a lot of adoptees. It's mourning the loss of your own voice and the fact that you yourself are just not heard and not validated and not accepted, even maybe within your own like adoptive family. Sorry, I do a lot of talking. Usually I don't do as much talking, I swear.
No, all of those things, Kat. Absolutely. It's just, oh, yeah, not feeling like you're accepted or can trust that you're being accepted even into this family that's telling you that,
Right.
you're just you're one of us. It's fine. Like, we don't think of you as like our adopted child. You're just one of us, and it's like, but if you don't feel those things, and especially if you have questions or then you try to use your voice and speak up too, and then you get this kind of like people either kind of like, I'm maybe being overgeneral about Midwesterners, but we like kind of like are like, oh, emotions, like, no, thank you. Like we just kind of like ignore it, or we just like, everything is fine, just pretend like it's not there, it's fine. And so if you're a young person too, or even as an adult, if you keep saying like, I'm feeling this like intense, like loss. I'm feeling this intense like pain. I'm feeling this intense anger. And then the response that you get from the folks who are supposed to like be just unconditionally like loving and accepting of you are just like, either like, oh no, I don't think that's the case, or like, let's not talk about that, or like, you're fine, or like, you should be more grateful. All those things too. It's just like, then we lose our voice, or we lose trust in our feelings, and like,
Right.
you know, like just how we see the world. And then it makes it even harder then for us to like speak up in the future, or to form like more solid sense of identity, and like, and yeah, I think exactly like you said, like trust
Well,
ourselves.
yeah, but it's also like when it comes to trust, trust is also like one of the very big things that I had to try to really work through. I mean, I didn't trust a single soul. I I felt like everyone was lying to me, everyone, you know. So, what is your do others in your experience in practice, do you think that other adoptees have you come into contact with other adoptees who have come to you and say, "Well, I can't trust other people. I can't trust myself. I'm supposed to be able to trust this person who's supposed to be looking out for me, but they're a narcissist. And they're not healthy for me. So, what do I do?" sort of thing. Like, is that something also that you come into contact? And what would be your advice for someone in that kind of predicament?
I think kind of to your last point too about this idea of like having a voice,
Mhm.
I think that's the first step, you know, is like if we are to trust other people, like we first need to like work on trusting ourselves and caring for ourselves. If we want to care for other people and show up for other people, we have to show up for ourselves, or be able to show up for ourselves in similar ways. And so I think that, you know, just having a space where people will just like listen and hear you out and like not judge like your experience. How can I judge your experience? I am not you. I've not lived a day in your shoes. So how am I supposed to come? Not all therapists are like this, but I think in a lot of like, you know, professionals then like want to, with like from a place of like helping, like wanting to help or whatever, but like sometimes like say too much, or kind of like over pathologize, or like just try to get into like, oh, I know exactly what you're saying. This is why these things are happening. And it's just like, but you're the expert. So I think when people talk about like the ways that, you know, trust or like attachment or different things from their adoption like interfere with like relationships, interfere with just like feeling, you know, like confident or feeling like grounded, like as a person too. It's like, let's go back to like reestablishing this idea of like, you're the expert though. We've looked to so many other people to tell us like who we are or who we're supposed to be, or we've just had people say like, I know better.
Mhm.
You know, I know better, and so I'm going to tell you what you are, what you're supposed to
Right.
be. So I think like, yeah, the groundwork is to like kind of break down these false like narratives or these stories that just don't work for us anymore and that just aren't true, and like reestablish this idea like where you are centralized then as the expert, as the person who knows the most and will always know the most about your experience. And then I'm the person there to kind of like help, like, okay, so what do we make of this? How do we like express this? How do we like build on this and make it like your greatest like strength of like you just being the expert in your experience? And that translates into like, yeah, stronger relationships with others. And yeah, but it's about you. And I think that for so long adoptees have never been centralized in this idea of like what it means to be adopted.
Right. And to let's if we continue on that path, like of what it means to be adopted, something from doing the podcast is that adoption means different things to everyone who basically comes on here. And sometimes there's hints of similarities. And recently I've been getting to interact with and interview a different sort of train of thought that's not necessarily what I had originally thought about adoption, and it's very very interesting. And it's kind of like the idea of in the only way that I can classify it in my brain is kind of like the idea of harm, purposeful harm, not just through like loss and like physically, you know, purposely causing loss through putting your child up through for adoption, but also just the notion of being sold. And to me, that is harm. I used to look at my life where I would say like I was trafficked, I was sold, and I was paid for. So what does that make me? And that would also put a lot of different things into perspective. And do you like, what is your opinion on that matter? I'm very, very curious, and I wonder what other adoptees in your experience probably have thought. Because I know that that's more common than I thought it was, the mentality sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I I think there is such like a wide spectrum, and like as a therapist, one of my main kind of things is like I have to keep my biases in
Right.
check. But I think in general, like as a person, just a person, but then also as like a professional person who works as a therapist too, it's like I truly believe that like everything is on like a spectrum.
Mhm.
And that's the thing that's maybe been problematic for a lot of adoptees in the first place, is that there's this idea of like all adoptees are the same, or all adoptees should be this one
Right.
way. And it's like, no, like even though we can share and like we have a different kind of connection because we have similarities because we are adopted, no one adopted person's experience and story is the
Right.
same at
Right.
all. And I think that there can be like multiple truths that happen at once. Like people can be like, feel like they did have a good life and they can have gratitude for like, where they are and like what their adoptive families have given to
Mhm.
them. And it can also be true though that like adoption is like $1 billion industry. Like people make money off that stuff. And if it was really about the kids, no one would be profiting off of
Right.
that. And also then people would listen to us a little bit
Right.
more. Because it's just silly that it's just like, well, it's about the children. It's just like, but we're like, hey, we're the children and we're saying something is wrong here.
Right.
And like we have lots of feelings, and they're like, no, you can't have feelings. And it's like, okay, well then maybe it wasn't about us to begin
Right.
with. But I think all of those things, even though they can feel like they're conflicting sometimes, those things can all be true at the same time.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, because that's kind of how I feel about it as well, where it's just there's just many moving parts. There's many moving parts to it, and it doesn't mean that just because there's so many different moving parts that certain parts aren't going to link up together and make sense. And it kind of goes, even for that, like it goes back to my theory, not my theory, my thought about just having the trouble of being able to express myself properly. So when someone kind of really invalidates it, it's like, you're not allowed to have feelings, you need to be grateful because society tells you so, and all of that sort of stuff. Or dealing with the aftermath of a narcissistic parent, which leaves eternal wounds, whether you see them or not. They leave wounds in your mental, your conscious, your unconscious, and your deep, deep subconscious as well. And it's kind of things that you never really shake off. And I don't know, like I feel like as adoptees, we kind of look at the world very differently. And what are a few things that you feel after having practiced can help adoptees just better maybe process or understand or help them sit with their own feelings in a comfortable manner? I guess that's probably the best way I can put it. And yeah.
Yeah. I think get get support. Like we all deserve help. There's nothing wrong with us. And like most of the people I work with, it's like you are all fine. Like you are doing excellent things. Like you could do it all on your own if you wanted to. But at the end of the day, it's like we all deserve to get like support and love and care and help. We shouldn't have to go on it on our own, because it's a lot to carry
Right.
sometimes. I think something that's so important that maybe we didn't get access to a lot or wasn't really even talked about is like this idea of like community with like other
Yeah.
adoptees. A lot of us grew up in households or like in neighborhoods where there weren't a lot of other adoptees, or if there were, it wasn't talked about. Like it was kind of like this weird taboo
Right.
subject. So I think that's such an essential part, is like that people don't have to go about this journey like alone. That's something that I think has been really hard for a lot of adoptees, is like we've never gotten the opportunity to like have someone be like, yeah, me too. It's like we were always kind of like the othered or like the outsiders for lots of different reasons, even within our own adoptive families. And even if it felt like we had parents who like were supportive and stuff, like they still, unless they're adoptees themselves too, and even if they are, they see it very differently than we do.
Right.
So yeah, I think people they deserve to like get like the support, and like have that community. And it can be through things too, like even just like listening to like these podcasts and like hearing other people share their stories, or like there's lots of like, groups out there, and it's not even support groups. It's just like, hey, like let's like go out and like do like adoptee shit together, or like just like be in a space that feels safe and comfortable, and where you don't have to like over explain yourself. People who just kind of like get you.
Mm.
I think that's like the most important like foundational piece that a lot of us like haven't had access to.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. When I found for example, like the Russian adoptee community, it was almost like a sense of belonging, and I found my people sort of thing. Humans were very herd mentality based, so we are social creatures by nature, and I think it gets hard once you take that away, and if you take it away from like a person, they become more not sad. That's definitely not the right word, but I would just say like the mentality sort of shifts, and it shifts into an unfavorable light in which you then see yourself, because you don't have that support. You don't have people kind of cheering you on and being your backup. And that was I love how I'm talking about like my experiences, which is, I guess this is why like I'm really like, finding a therapist who really specializes in adoption and post adoptees really, really, really is beneficial. I think it'll be very beneficial. And I don't know how to like, I just don't know how to word things properly, I'm realizing. I mean, I want to talk about divergence for a second, or like, I think it's called that.
Sure.
I think it's called that, where it's like you feel two opposing ways, and that those, like, okay, it's hard for me to explain, but it's almost like I want to go and find my family, but I feel guilty about leaving my adoptive family behind, and I feel guilt and shame as a result of that. And like, were there, like, what are your findings about that? Is this another common topic, or I would just like to know like your opinion on the matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, common, because of the complexities, because of like trying to live our lives and discover who we are, and also not being able to do that. Like we can't do it in a vacuum. We're always going to be affected by like our society and
Mhm.
like surroundings and things like that, and a lot of times those things conflict. It's like, yeah, I feel, sad, I feel loss, I feel like grief, and then also I have all these wonderful things around me that like maybe I also should or like would want to feel like happy about or grateful for, but it's just not happening for me. And so to be able to like practice to kind of hold like two truths or multiple truths all at once, like, yeah, I think that's something that I work on a lot with folks, and especially adoptees, because there is such a like, it's like an emotional roller coaster sometimes, or it feels like you're being kind of like pulled between two worlds too, especially folks who are coming into like different parts of like their adoption like consciousness, like maybe like uh, wanting to like explore a little bit more about like, their ancestry or like their cultural identities. A lot, for us like transnational like adoptees, it's like sometimes we come to a point in our lives where it's just like, yeah, that's like something that's like I feel like is really missing and is important to me. But then on the other hand too, like those of us who have been adopted into like white families or families that are of different cultures of like where we come from, and like our, where our countries of origin are, yeah, then it's hard, right? We're doing this like kind of like dance back and forth. It's like, oh, I have to, be like, American enough, I have to be Midwesterner enough or
Right,
whatever. But I also like am so curious about this other part of me that's always existed.
right.
And there's a lot of negative like kind of like responses I think we get from folks too, generally speaking, when I work with folks who are like exploring different parts of their cultural
Mhm.
identity. Families get kind of defensive about that. Adoptive families get defensive, or they're kind of like, why do you need that? Or it feels like kind of a slight against them. Or again, like we're not being grateful enough for like what we have. We're being greedy because we want to like know about this part of us too. So yeah, it's a practice, but it's not an experience that is just like, yours alone, Kat. Like I think a lot of us have are
Yeah.
there right now and we're working on that. But to know like all of those things can be true, and like all of those things are a part of us. Like we're American, we're,
Right.
we're, adoptees, we're whatever, we're all these different things too, and like we deserve to have and like love all parts of ourselves too, free from judgment.
Right.
What other people think, at the end of the day, it impacts us, but like does it really matter, or should it matter as much as it does? It's like, no, we should be able to like love all parts of ourselves.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I also really think about that in terms of just this again. I mean, I don't know. It's when I look at so many topics of adoption and just like mental health in general, to me, I see them as all completely intertwined within each other underneath the spectrum, like underneath the scope of adoption. And it's like even just the sense of I I mean, if it was tough for me, I can't imagine how difficult it must be for like other like transracial people and adoptees. I mean, and how like for me it was like I'm Russian, but I was too American to be Russian. I was too Russian to be American, sort of thing. And it's like that it adds a whole set of like complexity. And the one thing that I've really realized and learned and understood, always had this deep understanding of, is like adoptees have a lot of layers, right? And we need to be able to go through those layers with ourself, and we need to be able to sit with ourself. Um, I don't know. At the same time, I'm like, if you don't have yourself, like you don't have anyone else, right? Like, I don't know. You need the strong sense of self. And I guess in my predicament after, because my like I want to talk about like the death of adoptive parents, and like I guess we'll go back
Mm.
to the beginning of like identity, because my adoptive parents are both passed. I am now in Scotland, and it's kind of like I'm mourning so many losses, where it's like my adoptive mom and dad, who I was okay with, my adoptive family, who I hate. So I'm mourning the fact that I never had that relationship with them. I'm mourning the fact that I didn't really get to know my biological family, but I'm also mourning the loss of like I couldn't be who I wanted to be, right? So now it's like, who am I? And I want to talk a little bit about the fear of getting started and going on that journey to find yourself. Like, what is your advice for those adoptees? Because again, guys, you are not alone. So I don't know if anything I said makes sense. I apologize.
It all makes sense. It all makes sense. Yeah. Oh, I think that's what happens too when we have like really transformative things happen in our lives. Then we kind of have this shift, or like maybe sometimes like this question comes up as like, who am I now that this big change has happened in my
Right,
life? Whether it be like a loss, or like, maybe something really transformative and cool happens, we move, or like we start a new profession, or like whatever it may be. Those things can really kind of give us pause to be like, who am I now in the context of all these things that have changed in my life? It's scary. It can be scary a lot of times to just be like, I'm not sure if I'm gonna like what I find.
right,
And so I think that's, a lot of times what holds a lot of us back is just like, yeah, we have this really strong kind of, again, with those two like kind of conflicting like feelings or desires. Like I have this really strong desire to like know myself
right,
like on this deeper level, but also like I'm intensely scared about like what I might find out, and am I gonna like it?
right,
Am I gonna like me when I figure out who I am? And I think we don't we don't know. Like I don't have the answers, unfortunately. Even if I did, I don't want that responsibility. I
right,
wouldn't want to have those answers. But I think the more that we can, build our networks, build our community, recognize and be able to feel like prideful in like who we are, just in like little moments, that leads to like more sense of security and like finding ourselves. And so I think this idea of like sometimes therapy is just like we have these like revolutionary like just like aha moments where like just things like change, and it doesn't really look like that.
right.
It's more about like what we do on like a daily basis. And so that's what I would like encourage people to do too, is like recognize like the goodness in who you are like in this moment. And maybe the next moment, like we're gonna struggle with that. But that's like how we build or we come into ourselves, we find ourselves, is by like recognizing what's here and now, because the future is, as we all kind of like learned over the past few years, it's unpredictable. Like we have no idea what's happening, what's going to happen next, and we can be scared about that, or we can like take that as an opportunity.
Right. And I mean, for me, something I like to say is like, as an adoptee, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of who you were and the journey you took to get to who you are now, because it's a tough journey. Proud of who you are now, and I'm proud
Yeah.
of the journey you're currently on to get to the person you want to become, because that's an even scarier journey. You know, I sometimes I don't know what's more scary, the past or the present, right? But either way, we gotta head toward the
Yeah.
future. So,
Yep.
oh, all the metaphors, right? I live in metaphors. I wonder if other adoptees do that too, where it's just like I don't live in the real world. I live in the world of the metaphor. I don't even know if that made sense.
I mean, it would make sense like for adoptees too, where it's been a whole lot of uncertainty and a whole lot of like we just kind of have to imagine, or we have to just kind of like just harness something within ourselves, because we don't have like facts, we don't have answers, we don't have like documents sometimes of like where we come from, or like who we were born
Right.
as. And so we have pretty like spectacular imaginations, I think, sometimes, and like a really really strong like ability to like just like, yeah, go inward and like learn things about ourselves too, that maybe people who are not adoptees could never find, or would never know, like never be able to go on those journeys.
Mm,
So yeah, there's lots of strengths that we have, and lots of, yeah, wonderful skills and abilities that like we have as adoptees.
yeah. I mean, people are very often afraid of what they don't understand, and I think when people are afraid, it like you said, it forces you to go inward, but it also like I was born in the arms of my imaginary friends because I was afraid of the different things that I didn't understand happening in the real world, sort of deal, right? And as a result, I think it leads to your own form of greatness. It's just more about like recognizing that, and that can be difficult where it's like if you've had a tumultuous relationship with your adoptive family or parents, and they they kind of make you feel less than or not heard or not valued, and something that I think the adoptee community does really great is that when we meet other adoptees, we make sure that we bring a sense of you are valued, I care about you, sort of thing. And that's a really beautiful sentiment that I've really experienced in the adopted community. It was very like kind and warm and welcoming, and it felt good, sort of thing. What is your advice for adoptees for a little bit of self love and self care? What is one thing that you feel that they should do every day?
Oof, that's a really good question. I think if we can find our own ways of like showing like love and respect and kindness to ourselves every single day, great. And that might take a little work though, to decide like what it is that we
Mm,
need. But just getting into a practice of like even asking like how am I doing today,
right,
like that can be an act of kindness. And especially for those of us who feel like we haven't maybe been listened to, or like our voice has been talked over for so many years that we just, we don't get those opportunities, or we don't have those questions asked of us. Yeah, that's a great place to start, is just being like, how am I doing today? Like, what is it that I need? What is it that I want? And start asking ourselves those questions, start exploring about more about what we need and what we want out of life. And then yeah, finding community. And it can be other adoptees, it can be like, a virtual community, it can just be people who understand you and are open to listening to you. But yeah, find your people, check in on yourself, and make yourself a priority.
so unfortunately the episode I have to end it. There's so much more that I feel like we could just talk about, uncover, and really try to go in about. But I would like to thank you all for joining me on this episode of Chats with Kat. A very special thank you to our guest. Thank you so much for appearing, and thank you for having this conversation with me. I feel like it's important. to change the narrative about therapy. And stay tuned for another episode of my segment on the Voice of Adoptees podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and share the episode so that Lynn's voice can be heard. And just always remember, someone somewhere is thinking of you. You, not alone.